I found my husband's resignation letter while looking for a stapler. It was tucked inside a manila folder in the bottom drawer of his desk, printed on company letterhead signed with his actual signature, the loopy G he's had since college. The letter thanked his manager for 11 years of opportunity. It cited personal reasons. And at the top in small type next to the date field, it said something that made my stomach drop before I even finished reading the sentence. The letter was dated 4 months before the night he sat across from me at dinner, and told me calm as anything that he'd just found out that afternoon the company was letting him go. 4 months. He'd been coming home every day for 4 months, still wearing his badge, still talking about a project deadline that apparently didn't exist anymore, still packing the same lunch I made him every morning for a job he had already quit. I sat on the floor of that office with the letter in my lap for 20 minutes before I could make myself stand up. Because if he'd lied about that, I had exactly one question left, and it was the only one that actually mattered. What had he actually been doing every day for 4 months? If you've ever found proof that someone you trusted had been lying to your face in real time every single day, stay with me because what I found next was so much bigger than a job. My name is Renata. My husband's name is Josh. We'd been married 7 years together for 10. Josh worked as a regional sales director for a mid-sized industrial equipment company, the kind of job with a steady salary, a company laptop, a badge that beeped at the front door every morning at 8:15 like clockwork. Josh was reliable in the specific unglamorous way that makes a marriage feel safe. He set his alarm for 6:45 without fail. He ironed his own shirts on Sunday nights 5 at a time, hung in the closet in the order he'd wear them. He wasn't the guy who surprised you with flowers for no reason, but he was the guy who never once in 10 years forgot to pay a bill on time. We had a daughter, Maya, 7 years old, who Josh drove to school every morning before work, because his office started later than mine. That drive was sacred to him, he told me once. It was the only 20 minutes of his day that felt completely his. The night he told me he'd been laid off, I remember exactly how he said it. Steady voice. No tears, no anger. They restructured the regional team. Mine got cut. I found out this afternoon. He said it the way you'd report on the weather. I hugged him. I told him we'd figure it out. I made him tea he didn't drink and sat with him on the couch until almost midnight, running through numbers in my head, how long our savings would stretch, whether we'd need to pause Maya's swim lessons, whether I should ask for extra hours at my own job. I had no idea sitting on that couch with my arms around him, planning our finances around a crisis that didn't exist, that I was consoling a man for something that hadn't actually happened that day at all. That was in February. I found the resignation letter in June. Between February and June, Josh had what I now understand was an entire second daily performance running underneath our real life. He still left the house every weekday morning at 8 a.m., sharp-dressed for work badge clipped to his belt out of habit, even though it no longer opened any door that mattered. He said he was job hunting from a co-working space near his old office, that it kept him disciplined, that sitting around the house all day would wreck his motivation. It made sense. I never questioned it. I was proud of him honestly for handling a layoff with that much structure. I even told my sister that Josh was handling it better than I would have. He came home most nights around 6 sometimes, later talked about interviews that went well, but they went another direction about a recruiter who was circling back next week about a promising lead at a company 2 towns over that never quite materialized into an offer. Every excuse was specific enough to be believable and vague enough that I never had a name or a company to check against. He'd describe small human details, a hiring manager's chipped coffee mug, a joke someone made about the building's slow elevator, a moment where he thought he'd blown a question and then recovered, and I never once thought to ask why a man interviewing for new jobs kept coming home in the exact same clothes he'd left in. In April, I asked him gently if he wanted me to look over his resume. He said he had it handled. In May, I offered to introduce him to a friend of mine in HR at a logistics firm that was hiring. He said he'd already applied there, that it hadn't panned out. I never verified it. Why would I have? You don't fact-check your own husband's job search the way you'd fact-check a stranger. There was one moment in May I only understood in hindsight. Maya asked him at dinner with the blunt honesty only a 7-year-old has. "Daddy, do you even go anywhere anymore?" Josh laughed it off, said, "Of course he did that. Daddy was very busy interviewing." I remember thinking it was a sweet, funny thing for her to ask. I didn't think even for a second that she might have simply been noticing something true. What I didn't know, what I only pieced together weeks later, was that Josh hadn't been laid off in February at all. He'd resigned, voluntarily, in writing, 2 full months before he ever told me anything was wrong. The manila folder I found in June didn't just contain the resignation letter. It contained a printed final paycheck stub dated late February and a short formal email from HR confirming his last day and thanking him for his service with a subject line that read simply, "Confirming your departure." He hadn't lost his job. He'd left it. And then he'd spent 4 months getting dressed for a job he no longer had. I didn't confront him right away. I want to be honest about that because it surprised even me. Instead, I did what I do when something doesn't add up. I started quietly gathering everything before I said a single word, because I needed to understand the full shape of the lie before I could ask the right question about it. I went through our joint bank account first. His paycheck deposits had stopped in late February, exactly when the resignation letter said they would. But money had still been coming into a separate account, a checking account under just his name, one I knew existed, but had never really paid attention to the kind of account you assume is just where someone keeps their fun money or old savings. Between March and June, that account had received 4 deposits of $2,800 each labeled only as transfer. No employer name attached. No explanation. I stared at that word transfer for longer than I'd like to admit, trying to make it mean something ordinary. I called his old office using a voice as normal as I could manage and asked to confirm his last day for what I claimed was a reference check purpose. The woman on the phone read me a date in late February without hesitation, and then almost as an afterthought mentioned that Josh's departure hadn't been a layoff. HR's system listed it plainly as a voluntary resignation, effective immediately, no notice period served. I sat in my car in the grocery store parking lot after that call for a long time, running through 4 months of very specific evenings, replaying the coffee mug detail, the elevator joke, the interview he thought he'd blown. Details that had made the lie feel completely real. I'd believed every single one of them, and now I couldn't stop hearing them as performance instead of memory. That same week, something else surfaced that I hadn't expected. Josh's mother called me casually, asking whether we'd decided yet on the new place, a comment that made no sense until she clarified, confused by my confusion, that Josh had mentioned back in March they might be looking at a bigger house soon once things picked up. I told her nothing had picked up, that we hadn't discussed any house. She went quiet in a way that told me she suddenly understood she'd said something she shouldn't have. Josh had been telling people things, just not me. I started small. I checked our car's maintenance app, the one that logs mileage automatically for insurance purposes, and pulled up February through June. His daily mileage during work hours was consistent, almost too consistent, the same round trip 5 days a week to a location that wasn't his old office and wasn't the co-working space he'd described to me. I plugged the coordinates into a map. It was a storage facility 20 minutes from our house, the kind with individual garage-style units, not the kind anyone rents for job hunting. I drove there on a Tuesday, during what would have been his workday, parked across the street, and waited. At 9:40 a.m., Josh's car pulled in. He used a key fob to open a rolling door on Unit 114 and disappeared inside for almost 3 hours before driving to a coffee shop where, through the window from my car across the street, I watched him meet with 2 men I didn't recognize, papers spread across the table between them, one of them gesturing sharply like they were mid-argument over something on the page. I didn't confront him that day either. I drove home first and called the storage facility's front office, asking with a story about needing to verify a unit for insurance purposes, whether Unit 114 was registered to Josh's name. It was. It had been rented starting the last week of February, 3 days after his actual quiet resignation. I went back a second time 2 days later, this time earlier, before he arrived. I sat far enough away that I hoped he wouldn't notice my car, and I watched a delivery truck pull up to Unit 114 at 8:50 a.m. and unload 3 sealed crates before Josh had even arrived. Someone else had a key. Someone else was involved in whatever this was before my husband ever showed up each morning. That evening, Josh came home and told me about a promising second interview with the logistics company. I asked him as casually as I could manage how it went. "Really well, actually," he said. "I think this could be it." I looked at him and felt something I'd never felt in 10 years of marriage. Not suspicion exactly, but a kind of vertigo. The sensation of realizing the person across the table from you has become, without your noticing, someone you no longer fully recognize. I said, "That's great, Josh," and I meant it as gently as I've ever meant anything cruel. That night after he fell asleep, I went back through the photographs on my phone from the coffee shop, zooming in on the papers spread across their table, trying to read anything I could off the blurred edges of the pages. I couldn't make out words, only shapes, a logo, maybe a chart with bars that rose steadily left to right. Whatever it was, it looked less like a resume and more like a pitch. I didn't sleep much that night, lying next to a man I'd spent 10 years knowing, completely trying to imagine what kind of secret required a rented storage unit, unmarked deposits, and a small private circle of people who apparently knew more about my husband's life than I did. I confronted him 3 days later on a Saturday morning with Maya at a friend's birthday party, and the house quiet enough that there'd be nowhere for either of us to hide from the conversation. I put the resignation letter, the HR email, the mileage log, and a photograph I'd taken of Unit 114's rolling door on the kitchen table between us. I didn't say anything at first. I just watched him look at it, watched the specific way a person's face changes when they realize the performance is finally actually over. He didn't try to lie again. I'll give him that. He sat down slowly, put his head in his hands, and told me the truth in pieces, the way people do when they've been holding something too heavy for too long. He'd resigned in February, not because he was pushed out, but because he'd started a side venture 18 months earlier quietly with 2 former colleagues, developing a piece of industrial inventory software he genuinely believed could become something real. He'd been running it out of hours for over a year, and in February, an early investor had finally come through with enough seed funding that he made the decision alone without telling me to leave his stable job and go all in. The storage unit was their makeshift office, cheaper than commercial lease space, private enough that no one from his old company would run into him. The crates I'd watched delivered, he explained, were prototype hardware components for a client demo. The $2,800 deposits were his agreed monthly draw from the seed funding structured through a separate account, because the investment terms required all 3 founders to keep personal and business finances cleanly separated during the pre-revenue phase. The men at the coffee shop were his co-founders, and the argument I'd watched from across the street, he admitted, had been a real one, over whether to tell their spouses at all, or keep the venture quiet, until it either succeeded or failed completely, so none of us would be carrying the weight of a maybe. His mother knew about the new place because he'd told her back in March, in a moment of hope. He never repeated to me that if the funding round went well, they might finally afford to move. He said he regretted it the second the words left his mouth, that it was one more thing he should have said to me first, and hadn't. I told myself I'd tell you the second we had a real product, real revenue, something solid enough that you wouldn't have to be scared, he said. I kept telling myself just 1 more month, and then it was 4. I want to be honest about something most stories like this don't tell you. My reckoning wasn't a dramatic confrontation with an affair or a criminal exposed to the world. It was quieter, and in its own way, harder deciding what to do with a marriage built for 4 months on a foundation my husband had built entirely without me. I didn't destroy his company. I didn't leak anything to anyone, didn't sabotage the thing he'd risked everything for. Because as angry as I was, I understood that punishing the venture wouldn't undo the 4 months of lying, and it would only cost us more than we'd already lost. But I also didn't let it pass quietly. I told him plainly that trust wasn't something he got to rebuild on his own timeline in his own private compartment, the way he'd built everything else about this decision. I insisted immediately and without room for negotiation on full financial transparency, every account, every deposit, every business decision laid out for both of us going forward. No separate accounts, no version of our life he got to manage alone anymore. I told him plainly that whatever came next for his company, it came next as something we decided together, or it didn't come next inside our marriage at all. I also called Josh's mother gently and told her I understood now why she'd said what she'd said and asked her going forward to come to me directly if Josh ever confided something about our life that I hadn't heard yet myself. She apologized more than once and told me she'd assumed I already knew that she'd never imagined he was keeping it from me entirely. We spent 3 months in counseling working through the actual injury underneath the lie. Not the money, not even the fabricated interviews, but the specific corrosive experience of consoling a man for a layoff that never happened, of believing I was supporting him through unemployment, while he was in fact quietly building an entire future he hadn't trusted me enough to include me in. Josh's company, 6 months after I found that folder, secured its first real client contract. It wasn't the fairy tale ending where the lie gets erased by the success that follows it. I don't think a lie like that ever fully gets erased. But it became slowly something we were actually doing together. Finances, open decisions, shared no more storage units with rolling doors I wasn't allowed to know about. No more crates arriving before I even knew there was anything to arrive. Maya never knew any of it happened, and we've kept it that way. She still remembers that spring as the year her dad started picking her up early sometimes, which in the version she has was just a nice bonus, not the visible edge of an entire hidden life underneath our house. I've never told her about the question she asked at dinner in May. I don't think she remembers it at all. I think about it more than I'd like to. I kept the resignation letter. It's still in that same manila folder, though it lives in my own desk drawer now, not his. I don't look at it often. When I do, it isn't anger I feel anymore. Not exactly, it's something closer to a permanent, quiet reminder of how completely a person can be lied to by someone who loves them, and how a marriage can survive that, only if the lying actually fully stops. Josh and I still argue sometimes about those 4 months, usually late at night, usually circling the same unresolved question: whether he would have ever told me on his own, or whether I was always going to have to find that folder myself, looking for something as small and unremarkable as a stapler. I don't have a clean answer for that, and neither does he. What I have instead is a marriage that's more honest now than it's ever been, built strangely on the one thing that broke it in the first place, the moment I finally saw in black and white exactly how much distance a person you love can put between you without you ever noticing it happening in real time. Some mornings I still watch him leave for the storage unit, a real office now technically, though he still calls it that out of habit, and I think about how easily I could have never opened that drawer at all. How easily 4 months could have quietly become 5, 6 a year, a version of our marriage where I never once knew what I was actually standing inside of. I don't think I'll ever stop being grateful in a strange, complicated way that I ran out of staplers on exactly the wrong afternoon. If you found a document proving someone you trusted had been lying to you every single day for months, would you have confronted them immediately, or gathered the full truth first, the way I did? Tell me honestly in the comments. If this story hit close to home, share it with someone who's ever mistaken a quiet routine for the whole truth. He thought 4 months of silence would buy him enough time to fix everything before I noticed. I found it looking for a stapler, and what I found underneath it was never really about the job at all.